Today's lesson will focus on reading informational text. At the end of this lesson, you need to be able to analyze the events, procedures, or concepts in historical, scientific, or technical text, including what happened and why. We will focus on historical text for today's lesson. Before reading the text, there are several things you need to do to be successful. You need to set a purpose for your reading. Today's purpose will be to explain the events, so we know that we're looking for explanations as we read. We're also going to make predictions based on the text features to activate our prior knowledge. When we do this, we're making connections between what we already know and what we're about to read. To help with this, we'll look at titles, headings or subtitles, maps, charts, diagrams or graphs, photos or illustrations, or captions to make quick connections as we get ready to read. While we read, there are several things we do to keep this information locked in our mind. We may visualize or make pictures in our mind based on the information presented in the text. We ask questions and think about the answers or look for answers as we read. We make connections between this topic and other topics that are similar or other texts that we've read on the same topic. We make inferences or read between the lines, not focused only on the author's words, but adding in our background knowledge to come up with new thinking. We check our predictions that we made before we started reading the text, and we make new predictions as we go through. Our predictions don't have to be right. We actually learn more when we've made incorrect predictions and we're able to gather new information. And excellent readers always are summarizing the author's words into their own words through an internal conversation. We talk to ourselves as readers, and that allows us to retain the information and keep it locked in our mind for future use. When we're reading, it's important to annotate the text. In class, we often annotate by writing directly on a piece of paper. But when text is presented on the computer, it's often helpful to take notes. This allows us to remember all of these ideas that we had as we read and use that information as we move forward for our writing. Distinguished readers of historical texts analyze three key components. The first are the motivations and actions of people. Motivations are the thoughts or feelings that lead to action. We also analyze cause and effect relationships. These relationships can be between people or between events. And we also look at the sequence of events. In historical text, dates often appear, but it's most important to understand the order of the events, not always recall the details of the dates. You can always look up details like dates on a device, so it's not something we need to remember. It's important to remember what events happened in the order that they happened because that helps you analyze the cause and effect relationships presented. After reading the text, we're going to do two things. We're going to describe the event and we're going to explain the event. To describe, we're going to summarize who, what, when, and where the event took place based on what was observed from the text. We're giving a report, and it's important to think of it as a report. You want just the facts. Next, we explain the event. We give reasons for what happened, the why or the how an event took place. We clarify or explain the author's ideas. And we describe relevant connections from our own experience. When we write, It's important to remember that we write in our own words. We may copy parts of the text as long as we quote it and give the author credit. Let's take time to look at an example of this in practice. Here's a fourth grade text on a historical event. Before reading, I'll focus on the title, the image, and there's a word that I want to focus on. The title of this text is called The Civil War Begins. I know that as a reader, I can predict this is only about the beginning events of the Civil War. It may not talk about the end of the Civil War or all of the important people involved in it. If I wanted information on those types of things, I would look for text with different titles. I will also look at the image. This image is obviously a painting by an artist. It's not a photograph, so it doesn't depict what really happened, and it may include the artist's opinion. As a reader, I need to think about that. When I skim through the text, I also see the word seceded. I know this word is important because I've read other texts on the Civil War in which this has appeared. So I'll be sure that I understand the connection with this word in this text. Next, I'll go through and read the text. The Civil War begins. The Civil War was the worst war in the history of the United States. More Americans died in this war than in any other. People from the South were called Confederates or rebels. People in the North were from the Union. The war lasted 4 years. It started at Fort Sumter. The fort stood on an island. It was off the coast of South Carolina. South Carolina had seceded, so it had left the Union. But Union troops stayed at the fort. The rebels wanted the Union men to leave. The rebels would not let boats go near the fort. They told Union General Robert Anderson to give up. He was the leader of the fort. He said no. On April 12, 1861, Confederate General Pierre Beauregard fired cannons at the fort. It went up in flames. General Anderson and his men left. While I was reading, I took some notes that I will use to help me develop my writing. I know there are two groups that I need to focus on, the Confederates and the Union. I see that the Civil War lasted for 4 years. I know the first event happened at Fort Sumter on an island in South Carolina. I know the Confederates or rebels wanted the Union to leave the fort. There are two major people I need to focus on, Union General Robert Anderson and Confederate General Pierre Beauregard, and that this event took place on April 12, 1861. Now that I've read through the text, I will start my own writing. I see that the Civil War begins when the Southern states decide to secede from the Union. The Southern states wanted the Union Army to leave their land. When the soldiers didn't leave Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the Confederates fired cannons at them. They leave, but the battles will continue after this. This reminds me of the battles of Lexington and Concord. So, if you were evaluating my writing, you can see a few things. 1, I understand the main idea and details presented in this text. 2, I've made connections between this event and other events. This shows that I'm analyzing the event that happened. Today, as a writer, you will be reviewing text, reading through it, and doing your own writing.